Good morning. Welcome to this event. Welcome to Canary Wharf. There's a lot of you that have made it here this early in the morning, so we're very grateful for that. It's amazing to have you all here. So a big thank you to Alliance Magazine for putting on this event. It's amazing to be part of it. As you should all know, today we're speaking about systems change. So the panel themselves are going to be talking in much more detail about system change and loads of the different issues around it, but just very broadly, what is it that we're talking about, and why is the Thomson Reuters Foundation interested in this topic? System change, in a nutshell, is a recognition that intractable problems the world faces cannot be solved in isolation. Problems are interconnected and interdependent. Solutions are too. Organisations, programs, even decisions made by one organisation are interconnected with others, and the impact that they have ripples across a number of different organisations. As a very, very small example, if you think about trying to solve homelessness, just building loads of houses doesn't do it. You need to make sure there's psychosocial support, you need to think about welfare, healthcare, financial mentoring. There's a whole range of different issues, and this is the idea of trying to look at our whole system and how a system can be used to engender positive change. There are a whole range of things that you need to pursue in order to try and accomplish systems change. And our perspective is that a really fundamental part of this includes creative collaborations and information flow, and this is why the Thomson Reuters Foundation is interested in this space. Through our work, we look to empower individuals and organisations with the information, tools and resources they need to have an impact on society. Through our annual Trust Conference, we've created a platform where we facilitate collaborations between grassroots organisations, governments, academia, the private sector, professional service organisations, industry, media, trying to leverage different skills and expertise from a cross-sector perspective to try and raise the impact of social interventions. We try and take advantage of what different organisations can bring. It helps us broaden the scope and the approach of these interventions, and using these different angles helps make sure that organisations are able to try to look at a whole system. If anybody is interested in the conference, we're actually selling tickets at the moment. There's a little a hidden booth just over there, 30% discount this week for all Alliance Network members. There's a little plug there. Coming out of our conference, one of our big initiatives was the Banks Alliance Against Trafficking, where we brought together financial institutions in North America with NGOs and police and enforcement agencies, including the District Attorney of Manhattan, to work out how to share data that flows through financial institutions that relate to slavery and trafficking. Banks working in isolation isn't going to solve a problem, but being able to bring in other organisations so that we can get perspectives of patterns of behaviour, what traffickers might do, and then make sure that the information is provided in a format that can be used as evidence and that it can result in prosecutions, means that we're placing the role that banks play within the system in which they operate. And through this, we've been able to help the District Attorney of Manhattan dramatically increase the number of trafficking convictions that they've had in the US. We've mirrored the same approach now in Europe and Asia Pacific too. Through Trust Law, the Foundation's legal pro bono service, not only do we provide direct legal support to NGOs and social enterprises around the world, but we also produce tools and resources that are designed to strengthen the ecosystem in which organisations operate. And again, we try and do this by looking at different angles. Taking social investment as an example, we've got tools that help social enterprises understand what business structures they should use in 16 different jurisdictions around the world, which help make sure there is a pipeline in which social investment can go into. We've looked at impact investing in the US, the UK and India. We've got resources on social impact bonds in a range of different emerging markets. And we provide training to lawyers and other professional service providers to help them reframe and rephrase the advice that they provide so it's tailored to the impact economy. Again, all of this is not a single intervention, but we're looking at different ways that we can bring together a range of agents and actors to try and make sure that a whole ecosystem is strengthened. And this is ignoring the editorial services that we provide to try and make sure that there's just more information flowing and that audiences are much more easily able to make informed decisions. Our view at the Thomson Reuters Foundation is that sustainable impact ecosystems require information flow, and that it requires the skills and expertise of a range of different agents to be leveraged towards a single goal. This isn't the only thing that's required to ensure that systems change, But in our view, it's a fundamental part of it, and systems can't change without this. And this is the role that the Thomson Reuters Foundation plays, and this is why we're so excited to be here today. With that, I will leave our panel to go into far more detail and speak with far more eloquence than I was able to. But thank you very much, everyone, and it's nice to
Thank you, Nick. Hello, I'm Angela Seay, and I'm the chair of Trustees for the Polden-Puckham Charitable Foundation. Charles, as you probably guessed, is away, and I'll be taking his place this morning. Before I begin our panel on systems change, a few comments and housekeeping notes. First of all, if you'd like to subscribe to Alliance magazine today, there's a 20% discount if you subscribe today, and one of the Alliance team who are around here somewhere, I can't see anyone now, but they will be happy to help you. And also, you'll find there's an evaluation form in each of your seats, and if you would please take a minute to fill those out before the end, that would be great. And finally, do let Amy know, who's all part of the Alliance team, do let Amy know if you'd like to attend the June Breakfast Club, which will be on peace building and philanthropy, and that will be June 26th at the Paul Hamlet Foundation. And finally, I'm sure you didn't look, but on the back of your badges, apparently, fire instructions. Fire safety instructions, not fire instructions. We don't need to learn how to make a fire. Anyway, we have three speakers with us today who are all going to give opening remarks on their personal experiences and perspectives on systems change philanthropy. And we want to use this event to discuss the issues and the questions and trends raised in the recent special issue of Alliance magazine, and to provide the space for debate for all of you, most of whom are drawn from foundations, I believe, and the wider philanthropic sector. And following the Q&A, I think Nick mentioned we're going to see a little video, so the documentary section. And for those of you who haven't seen this Alliance issue or have had a chance to read it, I want to just mention a few highlights for the special feature. One, I'd like to first commend Julian's very personal introduction to the special issue and his own reckoning with the natural partnering of philanthropy and systems change. And he highlights how we need to look rather deeply at ourselves and the organizations that we work with. And in fact, this strand runs through probably all of the articles in one way or another. For example, Charles's interview with Rob Reich, who's the co-director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, is on the issue. He recently published a book called Just Giving, Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better. And of course, systems change can play a hand in that as well. Sandro Giuliani of the Jacobs Foundation discusses their work on the Ivory Coast, aligning their strategies with the foundation's DNA to achieve systems transformation. And that effort includes partnerships with other foundations to help build platforms for the community so that they can then rely on themselves rather than outside support. And another article focuses on systems change in Latin American philanthropic institutions, acknowledging that this is a continuous, dynamic, and also sometimes quite chaotic process. I'm glad someone admitted it. And Andrew Milner has offered a brief overview of organizations that take their own approach to systems change, allowing us to see how different donors in the philanthropic sector work on this issue. But now we're going to turn to our speakers. And our first speaker will be Julian Corner, who's the CEO of Lankelly Chase Foundation. He's been there for 8 years. He's also run a charity, I believe, and he's worked in government. So he has had a bird's eye view of a number of sectors that impact. And he will speak on the points raised in his guest editor piece, drawing on his personal and professional experience, and on Lankelly Chase's extensive work, particularly because they've been involved in systems change for some time. In fact, could be considered a leader. And we're hoping that he's going to finally define systems change for us. No pressure.
Thank you very much. And it was a great pleasure to be the guest editor. If Charles ever asks you to guest edit an edition of Alliance magazine, then I recommend it because he does all of the work and you get all the credit. My starting point for this edition is that systems thinking, which is the discipline that has really underpinned how we all think about systems, even if we don't know it, has itself been a very marginal discipline for the decades that it has existed. It's been the preserve of consultants, of academics, of R&D departments. And major corporations and governments have flirted with it, but have never fully embraced systems thinking. So foundations as a set of institutions that have brought systems approaches to the heart of their work feels to me to be a noteworthy phenomenon. And in the piece that I wrote for the edition, I identify a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, as we've heard, the time is ripe for this kind of thinking. We have a much greater appreciation of the interconnectedness of everything, but not least the issues that are vexing us all, including climate change, inequality, migration, and so forth. And so a discipline that speaks to the scale, the profundity of that challenge, no matter how inconvenient a discipline, feels right. The second is that foundations themselves feel peculiarly equipped for a systems role. And as I note, they are both of the systems that they are trying to affect, but they also sit apart from them. They have a particular kind of freedom to make choices, to adopt different methodologies, to opt in, opt out, depending on the strategic intent of the organization. So there's a maneuverability and versatility in foundations which lends itself to the maneuvering around the interrelationships between things rather than focusing on the things themselves. So I don't think it's an accident that foundations are the institutions that have tried to get hold of this discipline and that now is the time. There is a pitfall in the freedom that I've just described, but I'll come back to that at the end of my comments. Lankelly Chase itself, I think, is typical of most foundations in that we didn't just decide to become a systems-focused organization. We didn't just switch one day and say it's all about systems now. It has been a process of trial and error, of evolution, of iterative working. And this has often been a painful process of stretching ourselves beyond the limits of our own competence and so-called expertise. And a realization that most of the time when you're dealing with interconnectedness, what you have to come to terms with is uncertainty and not knowing. That system change sounds like an extremely assertive, perhaps even masculine kind of paradigm of we're going to change systems, and it sounds very impressive, whereas in fact, when you try and immerse yourself in that world, you realize how little you know, and indeed how much you have to deprogram yourself from everything that you've thought was true. And we still characterize ourselves as at the foothills of that, and I don't know if there are anything other than foothills. So in the piece, and apologies for those who have already read it and know this all too well, I identify 4 different attitudes to systems rather than 4 different system approaches or methodologies. I think of these more as attitudes or worldviews or even emotional positions. The first of which is foundations who realize that focusing on one bit as if it wasn't connected to others get to a point of trying to paint on a broader canvas, to try and bring more of the system into the work that they're trying to do. Now, of course, that creates an immediate problem, which is scale. How on earth do often quite small actors engage with something so overwhelming? And so there is a push to find so-called leverage points, which was a phrase first made very famous by Donella Meadows, finding points of interventions within the systems, which if you can just identify those will give you access to the rest of the system, a ripple effect, if you like. And so funding projects stops being a means to an end and starts becoming a means to rippling out to the wider system. So you start to judge a particular pebble in the pond by the ripples that come out from it. And this can include identifying people's individual rights as important and advocating for those, all the way through to funding disruptive innovation, which you hope will influence other parts. Then, if you pursue this thinking long enough, you can get to the point of realizing that this kind of neatly framed canvas, no matter how large you have created it, stops feeling so neat, and that the edges feel much more blurry and messy than you thought. That actually what you're looking at is not an objective image of a system, but actually a contested space that has multiple perspectives, and that you are but one actor with but one perspective within that space, which is a humbling moment. And then the mindset becomes more about attending to what is emerging in a system over which you have no control and can't hope to have much control, and starting to see where the energy and change is bubbling through that you can help to amplify and give a helping hand to. And this moves you more towards approaches based on network building or indeed movement building. Place-based approaches and collective impact have obviously become key strategies for foundations that are thinking in this way, and also reframing narratives, reframing how all of the system actors think about the issues at hand. And I'm describing these sequentially, they're not necessarily sequential. Some people start from the end of these four, but in effect, this is how it worked for me. You stop thinking of yourself as looking at a canvas, looking at a system, no matter how messy, and start realizing that you're in the canvas, you're in the picture yourself, you are part of the system. And that's the kind of slightly icky realization that many of the mindsets that you've brought to creating the solutions are closely akin to the mindsets that have been keeping the problem going. And that we are maybe all part of the problem that we're trying to solve, and our best intentions are actually perpetuating actions. And this is beautifully summarized by Peter Senge, the famous systems thinker, as out there is in here. The realization that the thing that you're trying to solve out there is the thing you're trying to solve in here. And this then comes to an appreciation of how we make the money that we're spending, how decisions are made, who gets to be part of this, who do we choose, who gets to set the strategy, etc., etc. And you end up with a kind of focus on the congruence between means and ends, a realization that I cannot purchase relational approaches through a transactional mechanism, that who I am being needs to be entirely aligned with the future I'm trying to create. Foundations that reach this realization are considerably more focused on responsible investment, how their money is invested and making the income that they need, but also move into spheres like co-governance, participatory grant making, and so forth. And then finally, there's the realization that the systems canvas is made up. It's just a model. It's not the truth. It's just a useful lens through which we can, if we want to, view the world, and that there are radically alternative ways of thinking about things that are less cognitive and speak more to deeper human needs of solidarity, mutuality, creativity, and so forth. I'll finish with 3 questions that have, I think, probably subsequently arisen since I wrote my piece and which I'd included, so this is a good opportunity to surface them. Should all foundations adopt a systems approach? No, but we are all part of systems whether we like it or not. We are all system actors. All of actions have an effect on the systems around us. So whether or not we think that we are a systems organisation, we nonetheless are in systems. And so I would advocate for a more systems-aware or systems-informed approach rather than something separate called systems philanthropy, whatever that might be. And that maybe we should start viewing our effectiveness in part as the effects of our actions on the wider systems that we occupy. Second question, is this the latest fad? Which I think is the question most of us ask of this. Yes, I think this is a word that has been sprayed onto many foundations' websites with varying degrees of integrity behind that word. But I also think it's very telling how many foundations have moved to a systems approach, because it speaks to the fact that we are wrestling with the limitations of our own agency in trying to bring about change. So it is no accident that this is the time that this has come to the fore. And then finally, what are the pitfalls? And as I started by saying, foundations as independent actors have this amazing versatility and maneuverability. So yes, we are potentially extremely good system practitioners, very useful ones. On the other hand, you can't suggest that everything is interconnected and then act as if you alone are not connected to the system that you're trying to change, as if somehow you are uniquely exempt from the very interconnectivity that you're trying to influence. And the independence of foundations comes largely from their wealth. Wealth can create the illusion, or maybe delusion, that you aren't entangled in the very thing that you're trying to change, and indeed that you aren't actually contributing to that. And there is a sense in which systems approaches in philanthropy haven't yet escaped the benevolence trap. So acting as if this entanglement doesn't exist is itself deeply unsystemic. It's having your cake and eating it. So I think some foundations are on a journey into that entanglement that they won't ultimately be able to escape. And that's the sting in the tail. It's a paradoxical position of tackling inequality by holding accumulated wealth. It is fighting for the empowerment of communities while drawing on income from multinational corporations whose behaviours are anything but empowering of those communities. So once the foundation starts to see that level of interconnection and really acknowledge that that matters, then maybe we'll start to get system change. And this is the acid test for whether foundations can be effectively the first institutions to embrace system thinking as a core discipline. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. The last time I heard you speak on systems change, it was oddly comforting, and I'm having the same reaction this time, so maybe you should just speak regularly on the topic to calm us all down about the definition. Our next speaker is Silvia Bastante. She's the Chief Philanthropy Officer of Co-Impact, and she'll be speaking to us from the vantage point of her work with that organization and the inspiration behind her efforts there. She's going to discuss some of the interesting trends and what are the ingredients for success for a systems approach in improving practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Angela. Thank you to Thomson Reuters Foundation for hosting us. And thank you, Julian, for that amazing introduction. You are certainly a hard act to follow. In talking about systems change and in general in philanthropy, I always like to start with self and where do we come from and what do we represent and what perspective, which is obviously only one perspective we bring to philanthropy. I'm originally from Peru, from Lima. And growing up in a country like Peru with so much poverty and inequality, one of the things my mother always likes to remind me is that when I was 5 years old, one of the most important questions I asked her is, "Mommy, what is the meaning of justice?" And of course, she found it really difficult to explain, especially in the context that we were growing up in. Why is it that some of us have a relatively comfortable life and other people, despite any efforts that they make, are caught up in a system that doesn't allow them to develop for themselves and to grow to their full potential? And in talking about philanthropy and systems change, I want to take you back to one of the experiences that I had advising some wealthy philanthropists in the space. I started my career working in Washington, D.C. for some of the large international organizations. I then worked for some NGOs. I then became a strategy consultant, did that for a few years. And in my previous role, before coming to Co-Impact, I was working for a large bank, advising very wealthy individuals on how to have impact with their resources. And one morning in Paradeplatz, the financial center of Zurich, I was meeting a philanthropist who had been on a trip to Kenya and had seen the black rhinoceros with their family. And they thought, oh, this is the most magnificent animal. I want to take care of this animal. I want to protect the rhinos. And I said, great, why don't you bring your family and bring your advisors and let's have a conversation about what you can do with philanthropy to try and help. And I presented the research that my team had done, but also all the experience from previous conservation efforts about the fact that if you really want to conserve the animals, pouring more funding into protecting them in Africa is only part of the question. You really need to change mindsets, and you need to address the demand side of the equation, essentially working to try to convince people that rhino horn is not as valuable as they may think it is, especially in some parts of Asia where it's associated with some magical powers that I will not describe any further for those of you who know what I mean. And I presented all of these findings, and I said, if you really want to do this, this is the way to address that. And the gentleman really thought about it for a moment, and at the end he said to me, Silvia, what you say actually makes a lot of sense, but I still want my park in Africa. And that was a moment of realization of how the individual drivers for philanthropy make sense for the philanthropists and make sense also for their foundations in many cases, right? Of course you want to tell your friends that you just spent 50 million and you have a park in Africa and they can come and visit and they can see the animals, right? That's what you want to say. Do you want to say, oh, I'm working with a group of non-profit organizations in Asia and I'm spending 50 million over the next, 10 years to do an informational campaign so that the citizens of certain countries realize that rhino horn is actually not that valuable? I mean, obviously, right? We're humans. There's a certain element of ego in philanthropy. There's a certain element of having closeness to what it is that you're trying to do. Don't talk to me about systems change, right? Tell me about when do I get to see my rhinos and when do I get to show them off to my friends in a certain way. And as much as I'm kind of, speaking candidly and making it sound fun, I actually do understand those are the drivers. And the problem for us working in the philanthropic sector is that if you put all of these drivers together, we get a system of philanthropy that does not deliver the forms of capital that the world actually needs to address some of our bigger problems. And I'll point out 3 specific things that in the research that Olivia Lennon, who's the founder of Co-Impact, did. She spent a couple of years speaking to philanthropists, but also to social change leaders to see what was not working in the system and what could we do differently with Co-Impact. So the first one is that most given remains incredibly fragmented and not aligned at all with the idea of systems change or large-scale change to start with. So most grants are given year by year. Maximum commitment is 3 years, but never somebody says, I'm going to give you a commitment for 10 years. The maximum amounts are up to 10 million, and they're usually quite restrictive. So I give you a grant to do X, Y, and Z, and do not even think of using the money to develop your organization, because obviously that's not directly the work, right? So it becomes really, really restrictive for the organizations that are actually trying to do this change. The other statistic that I like to cite is that 50% of foundations have less than $1 million in assets and no paid staff. And that is according to the report from the Hauser Center, the Global Philanthropy report that just came out earlier this year, or last year actually. And there's also almost an assumption that if these foundations or philanthropy is funding a small-scale pilot and it works, it will automatically be taken to scale. And that doesn't happen often enough. So for all these reasons, we believe that the funding that is being delivered is certainly not matching the needs or the aspirations of the sector. The second one is that, on the other hand, the social change leaders, despite their greatest intentions, because they're caught up in the system, they spend 30% of their time, in some cases more than 50% of their time, just fundraising, right? And fundraising year by year. So how on earth do we turn around and say, why don't you have a strategy for systems change for the next 10 years? What are your big plans? What are your big ambitions when we're not delivering that type of capital, but not only capital, but support for them to even have the space to think about this and to develop their approach. And the last one is also that there aren't enough efficient mechanisms for philanthropists and foundations to really come together if they want to do something collectively in the space. And in that regard, I actually think that bringing philanthropists together with the social change leaders in a neutral space can be a way to address some of the concerns that you have raised, Julian, in terms of the level of control that organizations exert, and just being a little bit more reflective about our own role within the system. That's easier said and easier done if you work together with others and you realize that you're part of that system as well. So in January, Going Back awarded our first round of what we're calling systems change grants for around 80 million. So Going Back is essentially a collaborative of philanthropists that are coming together to hopefully affect large-scale change. We have 5 core partners, amongst them some of them more established philanthropists, so Bill and Melinda Gates, Jeff Cole, the Rockefeller Foundation, Rohini and Nilekani and Richard Chandler are our initial core partners. They contribute very significantly. We also have what we call co-investors, which are foundations and philanthropists that join us at the tune of $5 million. And we also have a co-impact community, which are foundations and philanthropists who join us at a minimum of $250,000 per year for a minimum of 3 years. And they really join us to learn by doing together. So to join us for the whole process of sourcing and supporting these amazing initiatives. And the first grants that we awarded are relatively large-sized grants. Normally we do between 10 to 25 million over 5 years. We can even extend that up to 50 million in exceptional cases. What we look for is places where there's already evidence of impact. And verifiable third-party evidence. It doesn't always have to be a randomized controlled trial, but anything that would pass a certain test to convince us that something is beyond the pilot stage, so something that is already working in low and middle income countries in the topics of education, health, and economic opportunity. And we look really for a coalition of actors that is already committed. It's rarely scaling one organization by itself, but it's really scaling sometimes an approach or a change in the norms so that the solutions hopefully are successful in the long term and are sustainable in the long term. Our support is for 5 years. We completely realize that systems change is not going to happen in 5 years. Normally it would take 10, 15, even 20 years if you look at some historical examples. But that is our starting point. And that's as much as we could also get our funders to make a significant commitment for 5 years too. And actually before we even award the systems change grants, we give what we're calling a design grant, which is 6 to 8 months, around $500,000. And that's really to create that space for the coalitions of organizations and the social entrepreneurs working with their government as well to really think about what their plan could be. At the same time, we completely recognize that systems change very rarely goes according to plan, and that if somebody were to tell you that they're an expert in systems change, I would tell you that they're lying, because systems change, as we have heard, is incredibly context dependent. And we are not experts in the places where we are working. Our role, as we see it, is really to support those organizations at the forefront that are well positioned to make the changes that they seek in their own systems happen. So on that regard, we do follow the 4 approaches that you mentioned at different points, different ones, different times. We do think that with systems change, it's not about changing every single aspect of the system, because if you really analyze the system, however you bound it, it's just so complex. So we do follow a little bit the idea of trying to find one lever that we can affect. And I'll give you a concrete example. In the area of education, we have awarded a grant to an organization called Child Africa. It's a combination of Pratham, this great NGO from India that have pioneered this approach, working with the MIT Poverty Action Lab. And it's a methodology to help teachers in public schools do differentiated learning within the same classroom. Sometimes they have very large class sizes, and it's a way of teaching teachers to teach the children in a differentiated way so they learn basic maths and reading and writing. Now, we're not in the countries in which this is operating together with the governments. There's multiple countries in Africa where this support will be given. We're not trying to change the whole education system. We're not saying we're going to do curriculum reform in so many countries. We're going to do X, Y, Z. The only lever that this initiative is focusing on is just the quality of the teaching of teachers, right? So that's, it's a little bit reductive, but it's an approach, because otherwise it's incredibly difficult to think that you can affect, change in many different directions. The second point I would make is that it's really about a strong coalition of actors, as I was saying, that in most cases will involve the government in some way or another. And we particularly value leadership that is based or has strong roots in the Global South, where we are operating, and that can understand the context and that can make sure that women and other disadvantaged groups, the voices that we don't always hear, are represented within the system. And the last point I will make on this is that, systems change initiatives certainly require a learning adaptation and a commitment, let's put it that way, to experimentation and learning. And we seek that not only in the organizations that we choose to support, to whom we don't refer as grantees, but we refer to as program partners, because we're trying to change a little bit the power dynamics that come into it. But it's just reckoning with this uncertainty and not knowing that Julian was also referring to. And we try to not only look for that in the organizations that we support, but also embody that ourselves. So on that note, I could tell you a lot more about what I believe we need to do as funders to be fit to support systems change, but I'll leave that for the Q&A. And I'm very pleased to be here with all of you, and we are in our own learning journey. I've only been in the role for a year now, so I very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvia. It was a wonderful compliment to Julian's presentation, and also I so appreciated your personal journey, hearing more about your personal journey, because it very much informed what you said later. I'd like now to introduce our final speaker, who is Eva Rehse. She's the director for Global Greengrants Fund in Europe, and she's the member of the EDGE Funders European Steering Group. She's going to speak about how Global Greengrants works to transform systems with its grants and the global perspectives that she's found as a result of this work. And she's asked the question, does systems change need to start from within, or by changing the system of philanthropy itself? Or perhaps both.
Thank you. And thanks, Alliance, for inviting me. I think we'll be switching scale quite rapidly now from the 80 million down to what does this actually mean for people? And so that's what I want to focus on. So if we're looking at the grassroots perspective into systems change. So Global Greengrants Fund, we were set up to challenge the philanthropic system, and we were designed to flip philanthropy on its head. So we're an activist-led grant maker. The solutions and the decisions on where the funding goes are made by communities themselves. rather than by programmatic experts sitting in global north countries. And that's very deliberately done to offer an alternative. And we can talk about what's better, what's worse, how does scale fit into this. I'm happy to be challenged on this. But the thinking behind it was that we are faced with multiple systems. I want to use the word root causes or drivers as well to swap this out, that are driving our ecological crises, our social crises. And at the very micro level, what does that look like? How are people experiencing that? And how are people finding solutions to that? And how can we support that through a small grants model? So those were the questions that Global Greengrants Fund started out with. So if we're looking at climate change, I think climate change is the obvious one to go to. We know it requires more than just exiting coal or exiting fossil fuel. We know it requires changes in our economic system. It requires changes in our individual behavior as consumers and how we live, our consumer mentality when it comes to our lifestyle and the desires that we have. So we also know that we need to radically change this because we have about 12 years left to stay under the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. We know that it's quite unlikely that we'll get there. So what do? We have these very urgent individual crises and we need to change our lives, and people in countries that haven't historically contributed to climate change but are now feeling the impacts already need to adapt to this, and at the same time need to question the extractivist economies that have led us this. What are the alternatives here? When we thought about this, our whole theory of change is built around movements. We can't do this on our own. We can't think in silos, and I think this is coming through in the previous speakers as well. So I really like what Julian said around the messy contested systems, thinking in all sorts of different places at the same time. Place-based approaches, which is obviously how we're approaching it as a funder. Collaboration, lifting up the lesser heard voices. I really like that you mentioned that because that is at the heart of what we're doing at Global Greengrants Fund. And then reframing the narrative. I think I will actually give an example right now to illustrate what this can look like because I want to make sure that it's rooted in understanding the lived experience of people. So I give an example from Burkina Faso, where we have been supporting rural women that are primarily taking care of the land, protecting farmland. And in our model, we have focused on giving money to those that traditionally don't have access to any decision-making or financial resources. So women are a big constituency of that, as are young people, as are indigenous people or people with disabilities. These women are protecting the land from degradation that is happening due to small-scale mining, which is illegal, which is a male profession. So the men go out, they mine on this land, they are degrading the land that the women are farming to make their income, so they're selling the produce that they grow on the land. So what is the entry point here to address both the immediate needs, the environmental degradation, the food insecurity, but also the larger systemic issues behind it, the gender dynamics, the access to economic opportunities, the fact that extractive activity is a huge part of contributing to climate change, and already the land is being further degraded due to climate change. So is it enough to say we give the women the tools to make sure that the land in some way is restored, to protect the land, or is there something else that we need to do? And so each of our grants has 3 components. We fund with small grants, and that is on average about £5,000, so we're talking about a very different scale. People to protect their land, to restore their natural resources, and to transform the systems that have created the problems in the first place, to transform the systems in which they work. So if we're looking at land, around the world, 60 to 80% of the food that we consume is produced by women. Women grow this food, but women only own about 2% of the land. So here's a huge entry point to think about this in a more systemic way about change that will have an immediate impact on the women, on the whole communities, given that women are the natural resource manager in many societies. tackling the economic system and the societal structures. And so in making them advocates and helping them become advocates for land rights, women are changing the system in how land and natural resources are managed, who owns it, who takes care of it, but they're also challenging the economic system, an alternative to the mining, to the small-scale mining that is happening, as well as a patriarchal structure that has, for a long time, made sure that women don't have access to land and land ownership. So there's all these different systems happening in one single person often that we're supporting with a small grant. Then at the same time, they're tackling root causes for environmental degradation, for climate change, inequality, poverty, all of these things that are so connected, and we've heard that, and that then disproportionately affect women and exacerbate gender inequality. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes a very small grant can change at that micro scale, can massively change systems as well as individual people's lives and improve them if you start thinking in a systems way about your funding. And the way we're doing this is very much in collaboration, and I want to talk a little bit about collaboration because we recognize we can't do everything at the same time. We're not experts in everything, and there are many others who are thinking in similar ways, and we're seeing here the different ways that could look. So to actually bring in the lived experience of the communities as one collaborator, but also then other funders, for example, funders who have expertise in funding in a feminist way and funding women's rights issues, has been really helpful for us to strengthen how we give and how we think about giving. And part of that for us is EDGE funders, and since Angela mentioned it, I want to just spend a little bit of time on it. You might have seen the article written by Tobias and Ari in Alliance magazine, which I think offers a slightly different perspective. So EDGE stands for Engaged Donors for Global Equity, and this is an alliance of funders that came out of the US, but has really, I think, found a political home in Europe in its many different ways of thinking about systems change, which can be quite different from the American perspective. And EDGE understands the system as the extractivist, capitalist, political economy that is our economy, our way of life. And so is also seen as the root cause for economic, social, political, environmental issues that we're facing. And as is outlined in the article, EDGE is looking at how do we build an alternative to that. And we always think in sort of threes again. So we're thinking about reject the bad, embrace the good, keep the good that's already in our system. There's much good here, and then build the new. So in a very simplified way, that's the thinking that EDGE is working towards. And as the members in EDGE, we've sort of mapped where are we? Where are our entry points? Some of us are just rejecting and resisting, but some of us are already building the alternatives. And as I hope the Burkina Faso example has shown, most of us are doing all of this at the same time and in parallel. So that's the idea of the just transition that you might have heard to this new alternative green non-extractive economy that EDGE is working on. My last point I want to make is about philanthropy as a system. Because when we as global Greengrants want to think about ourselves within philanthropy as a system, we are really clear that we can't have that systemic change that we're advocating for at the very micro level, and then sort of in conversation with our collaborators and with EDGE at the very global level without challenging philanthropy. And we've heard a little bit of that already. I want to be a little bit more radical and talk about how we can decolonize philanthropy. And that, for me, really is the key here. We've started a new initiative within EDGE to really look at the power dynamics, to look at the diversity within philanthropy in Europe and the systems that underlie the wealth that powers philanthropy. So white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism. Who gets represented? Who sits on this panel? Just even these very simple questions about who gets to speak and how are we upholding that in our philanthropic system. So the question, where does systems change have to start? Is it within? Is it with our organization? Is it in the system of philanthropy? It's all of these things, and it's all of these things at the same time. So we as individuals need to understand. I'm looking at me. I need to understand my privilege, working where I'm working and holding power, albeit in an organization where I don't have a say where the money goes, very deliberately, but I still I was still key to many of the resources coming in. So acknowledging that and understanding that even as a woman facing a lot of systemic issues, I'm very privileged, and to understand that. And then how does that translate into how I build my organization? We're a very young foundation, so how do we want to represent ourselves? And then what does that mean for the wider field we work in? Again, understanding that if we start acknowledging all of these issues within ourselves, we're able to actually talk about it and then change the system in which we work. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with critical self-analysis. A lot of that has to do with de-siloing how we think and de-siloing how we work. And understanding that we're part of the system. Even us as fundraisers, we are very much part of the system. And how do we challenge it? So I want to just leave it at that, and I'm very interested to hear from my fellow panelists and also from the room how this reflects in your work and how you see entry points for your own work in thinking about this.
Eva, thank you so much. You brought yet another perspective to this actually kind of complex issue when we think about it. And you brought a perspective that I thought made for quite a bit of hope for all of us to see that there were ways in which you can take both small amounts of money and much, much larger amounts of money. And that also helps you see the complexity of what we're trying to deal with. So now it's your opportunity to ask all of the questions that we have time for. I think we have till about 10:30. So I welcome, already one in the second row.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Viloria. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think you really touched a big part of me. And I just want to share really, it's not a real question, it's just more of sharing of where I'm coming from. And you're asking how do we contribute, how do we take this forward. And just a quick story, my background is actually abject poverty in a rural community in the Philippines. That my mother actually had to leave me when I was 8 to come to the UK and become a waitress. So fast forward, in my 20s, I became the first investment banker in the UK out of a lot of contemporaries that I had here in the Philippines, in London. I guess in my mid-40s, or early 40s, the midlife crisis, I started questioning, who am I? What am I doing here? I had 2 kids, private schools, London, typical banking background, and yet I kept going back to my hometown and saw abject poverty. A lot of my cousins, relatives were leaving the Philippines to become domestic helpers. You know the story, you see them everywhere. I even saw a lot of them in the school where my children went to, and I was actually, people thought, a lot of the parents thought I was one of them. Just imagine that. So I had to fight this kind of, I guess, battle to lift myself up a lot, more than your typical mother or woman, being that in London particularly. So what I have done is, I had a little capital and I started learning about impact investing. And I joined Clearly So Angels, and I started looking at what are the opportunities to use my money rather than donating it to charities. I could utilize my money to invest in companies that are doing good, particularly in rural communities around the developing world. And that's what I did for a number of years. I learned, I invested, my own portfolio, my own pension fund as I call it, but I did a lot of things to de-risk that investment so that now, 6 years, 7 years later, I have a portfolio that's doing well. Okay? So 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, I moved to the Philippines because for me, I had to go home to help my country, and particularly in rural communities where I've come from. So I've started my own venture. This is why Isla Venture is about, to really look at what are the opportunities or social enterprises, inclusive businesses that are operating here that do not have the platform to access the right capital, to be actually, kind of be present to the kind of wider scope of the investment community, because I think the way forward is not to donate our capital, excess capital, but to actually utilize whatever we have spare to invest for the greater good. So we're looking at how do we actually channel the kind of funds that's available from that kind of micro, if not even higher, moving forward, rather than donating it to charity. Invest, have fun doing it, and that's what I've done.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you. In the second row, in the blue, I think it's a blue jacket. The lights are quite.
Used to be blue.
Okay, good enough.
I just went.
Of course.
Thanks very much. I thought it was a great panel. Very, very interesting and really refreshing in a way. So my name is Trevor Aries. I have an organisation called Enso Impact that is largely working in East Africa on access to energy. And I don't know where to start with this because there's so much here. And I suppose there's a question that's about catalysts, right? And the how you see the role of catalysts in your work. And I mean that in the sense of, I see finance as a catalyst for systemic change. But in order to create the most effective change, you have to create the conditions in that system for that catalyst to be effective. And part of that is about timing, I think. And certainly my experience of trying to raise early stage finance in particular is that it's very, very difficult. And that is where the catalytic finance from philanthropists can be most helpful. So I'm kind of interested where you see the real opportunities around that. And perhaps if there's a follow-up from that, if you connect that to the point of impact, where are the opportunities and how do you see that where it's most needed to achieve the greatest impact? I'm interested in energy in East Africa, particularly biomass, which nobody seems that concerned about because it's difficult, but that's my angle. So for you, what's the role of catalysts and where do you see the greatest opportunity and impact?
Thank you. So who would like to take that one on? Don't be scared.
I can venture an answer to that one. So the role of catalysts, catalysts are essential in this space. The way at least I see catalysts is individuals who know the different worlds and who can mediate between them, essentially. Because even though we think that the worlds are converging and the business is coming closer to non-profits, to government, it's not happening enough, in my view. And it's actually very valuable to have people who have had experiences working in all of these sectors so that they can see different perspectives and bring that. So in that regard, I think catalysts that are trying to mediate between these different sectors and try to make them collaborate or help them to at least understand somebody else's perspective are essential. In terms of, where can you have most impact? That is actually an incredibly difficult question because it depends on which lens you look through it, right? So personally, with Co-Impact, we work in education, health, and economic opportunity. I would say those are three very good starting points. I would also say that climate change is something that concerns me personally very much because it also has a deadline and a timeline. And with the other things, if we take a bit longer, hopefully the world doesn't disappear, but with climate change, I am personally very concerned, right? I personally care a lot about human rights, having worked for Amnesty International in the past. But, I think it's almost a value judgment to be able to say which area is most important. What I'm personally interested in is how can we make the system of philanthropy deliver the forms of capital that all of these areas actually need. That's a very personal view.
Yeah. Well, on that last point, I think we fall into that trap to sort of say, but climate change is the most urgent issue, and we need to do it with everything else. I think we have to acknowledge that everything has to happen at the same time now. All of the struggles have to happen and be fought at the same time. And as easy that is to say, as hard that is to do. I think it's about acknowledging that ecosystem in which we operate, right? And understanding, are there gaps that need to be filled where there's currently no one really looking at this? So, your example of biomass and energy access. Is nobody looking at this? Let's look at this. And realizing there's enough capital around to really answer these questions. We just need to stop focusing on sort of the poster children and actually spread our bets a bit more. Fight all the fights at the same time. That's my response. Thank you.
Also, I think it's foundations' responsibility to take risks. I think many foundations see themselves as being able to take the risks that others can't. For example, government funding usually doesn't come in early, but when it comes in quite large. But foundations also suffer from a failure of imagination. And it's hard to, and they don't sometimes know that they're suffering from a failure of imagination. So it's quite complicated. It seems easy to the potential partners or grantees, partners, I like your term. It seems easy to them, and why don't foundations get it? But that's, I think, where some of the problem lies as well with catalysts, is the people that can provide the catalyst often aren't ready or fully understanding how they can do so through that failure.
And I think the thing that we see repeatedly is there is a role that foundations struggle to fund or believe in, really, which is that there are some people who are trying to hold the space that exists between the system that needs to, the dying system that needs to crumble away, and the one that needs to be born, or the one that is struggling to be born. And it's much easier for foundations either to fund innovation to sustain the old system, or to fund unsustainable examples of the new system. But it's those people that sit between those two who do the hard yards of creating the conditions by which the new system can come into being, which tend to be very lonely positions because you have neither the credibility of the two worlds. You're the kind of the bit in between. That kind of role seems to me to be precisely what independent money can give rise to, and that foundations can help network those people, because I see it almost like an emerging discipline of the transition discipline of how do you get from one to the other. And it is frustrating that foundations seek safety in the two paradigms rather than the people who are actually doing the work to get from one to the other.
Could I just add a point there? I love what you just said. I was at a meeting with some people from Ashoka. They're talking about this idea of weaving, exactly as that concept of trying to bridge between these two worlds and creating the space for something new to emerge. And I wanted to come back on the point that you made and that Angela made, is yes, foundations have a crisis of lack of imagination about what their role could actually be. And also, as you said, Julian, they have the freedom, but they don't actually use it. So in theory, foundations have the freest money in the system because they can decide to do whatever they want and they have very little, in the big scheme of things, accountability requirements. In practice, they do not behave in that way. And to me, that is almost, it's so surprising in a certain way. But it is a reality, and they face their own constraints, whether they're real or imagined. And I think part of our role, or at least what we try to do, is just influence this whole sector to see, what are different ways that we could do with that level of freedom that we actually do have.
Well, we have no shortage. Where to begin? In the second row, and I cannot see the color of your jacket. These lights make you colorblind.
Hello, I'm Tom Harris, and I work for the JJ Charitable Trust, which is one of the Sainsbury family trusts. I was really interested in that point about transition just there. So we've got a new program, or just creating one about fashion, and it's really interesting that the analysis shows that the real problem is the business models of the big fashion houses driving unsustainable behaviour, but they're also the companies funding most of the work to make the fashion system more sustainable. One option is to fund groups sort of knocking at their doors and attacking them from the outside. Have you explored ways in which, you can actually help the transition that doesn't rely on most of the organisations involved in it. I'm just trying to pick through, like, what can we do to deliver what you're suggesting?
So your point is that how do we create a future that doesn't rely on people vested in the past?
Yeah. What are the steps that you're actually recommending foundations take?
I'm not recommending foundations the steps that they should take. But good to go back to an easier question, which is what do you do? I think that I can't see any alternative than to try and view the future as already here. The positive deviance notion of the future is trying to be born already, because if your starting point is a blank sheet and I have to create the future from scratch right now, then there's not enough time for that, and also who am I to do that? But so what we certainly try to do, and others will have different strategies, is to try and find and get alongside the people who are already starting to hold that space, and they could be anywhere. They can be in the institutions that you view as the most harmful, all the way through to the people who are hammering on the doors, and to try and find where the common cause lies, and to try and build the networks and the commonality of interest. And that's not to say that you box people into a kind of uniform understanding of what you're trying to achieve, but you find ways by which multiple perspectives can be accommodated. The notion of that being that what you're trying to do is not do system change in the sense of replace one system with another, but to notice the emergence of the new system from within the one that already exists, because we are each trapped, as we've been hearing, we're each trapped in the paradigms that have created all of this. Some people are willing to step forward and try and envisage something different and feel an emotional need to do that. And I think foundations can have a key role in helping those people to understand, wherever they are in systems, in the state, in business, in voluntary sector or wherever, that they're not going mad and they're not alone. And actually, it's to create that sense of some kind of critical mass that gives legitimacy and body to the future. Because the future tends to, I described it the other day as connecting more of the future to itself. Like that at the moment, it feels incredibly diffuse and fragmented, whereas the system we've got feels solid and utterly self-sustaining and inviolable. So to create the alternative, you need to create an alternative sense of critical mass that can challenge that, and that has to come from releasing as many people as possible from the constraints of what they're working with.
All of that, and to add to that, I think there's so much potential in thinking about the alternatives and the new, and so much positive narrative that people get excited about and rally around. And we see that in the climate change space, right? We see it sort of multi-generational across the political spectrum. Excitement also, I mean, lots of fear and lots of worry, but also an excitement. Here's still an opportunity to create something new, and let's all come together and try and work that out. And that's what gives me hope in that work. And I think we see that from the very micro up to macro level work that's happening. So I think that's a really important one to hold on to, is that narrative, that positive narrative that we can create something new, and this transition will be to something better.
I would echo what both Julian and Eva have said, and I would just add that in a very, very practical way, what foundations can start doing is providing a lot more flexible funding, long term. So please don't do 1 to 1 year grants. Nobody can plan, nobody can think about what they can achieve if they're bound by a calendar of only 1 year. Sufficient funding, for the long term. Support the coherence that whoever it is that you're supporting wants to have. So, if their view is that they're changing things in this way or that way, support that whole package. Don't come and say, we only fund this little piece of your plan, and I want a super detailed report every 2 months about what you've done with my money. So it's just like that approach of really being supportive. Reduce all the unnecessary burdens. One of the things that we talk to our program partners about is just tell all your funders that you're going to do a single report for everybody. I mean, seriously, to have people whose job it is to cut and paste for multiple timeframes, for multiple reports, doesn't make absolutely any sense. And then really the most important thing is just really behaving as true partners. True partners treat each other with trust, with respect, and they value each other's contribution in the same way. And that's going to the core of this power dynamics in the funder relationship. So in addition to everything else, those are really practical things that philanthropy can do to deliver the type of capital that hopefully would help the new system emerge.
Thank you for that. I think we'll go to the side of the audience. The young woman in the green.
Hi, my name is Shira. I'm with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. So my question is really around the age-old question of collaboration between the players, in this case some of the foundations, who are trying to address the same issue, and sometimes in the same places as well. But often you see very little collaboration between these players, and they're all trying to reinvent the wheel, or someone's trying to make their own mark, but you could actually be working together. Now that we're on the topic of systems change, I do think there is a need for this to actually be a key discussion around. For example, if you even take some of the panelists on the stage now, your work on economic empowerment alongside with the Global Greengrants Fund's work on economic empowerment, is there a way that these players can actually work together? If you have best practices, what are some things that foundations can do to work together? Are there examples of things that have really worked? Anything that you can add to that?
Well, I can give an example of something that's worked for us really well, connected to the example that I gave. So we're part of a global alliance of women's funds. So these are community funds that are specifically funding women, and environmental funds like us. And we're about 30 partners now working globally, trying to both mobilize and then move resources to grassroots women's environmental work, specifically to strengthen the advocacy work of these women. So while we acknowledge a need needs to be met, we want them to become advocates, and that's a sustainability piece. And that's been a really important learning curve, because we realized women's funders are looking at women, and they realize women have a lot of environmental needs. Environmental funders are looking at the environment, and they're realizing women are key to help them protect it. How do we start talking the same language? How do we start aligning our strategies? How do we start funding the same people but with different entry points and different priorities? We are 4 years into a 5-year experiment, and I think it's been the most rewarding piece of work that we've done, because it's enriched us, it's helped us speak in a different language, it's opened up new spaces for us, for the groups that we support. And we can see real movement also in the environmental space towards thinking about gender and gender justice as a part of that. So I think that's where collaboration really works well. There's a lot of analysis why it's worked well. I think the big one is we had a big funder behind it. So a government has funded the 5 years of this. This wouldn't happen if we had to actually go out and raise money for it. I think that's a really important one. If everyone is clear what they're bringing in and it's resourced, it'll work. It'll work. I've also seen collaborations not work so well, and often it comes down to there being no buy-in from the leadership and there being no resources then allocated to it. So I think that's a concrete example where I would recommend to everyone, start working with people outside of your comfort zone and your silo, and see what that brings to your work.
I could add that the whole movement towards more collaboration in philanthropy is growing, but collaboration is essentially very difficult. And that's because to collaborate with somebody else, you have to give up a little bit of control. If you're working with others, you're not going to have it your way. You're not going to have okay, you can eat it and do it in exactly the way that you want to do it, right? And that's why it's really difficult. And when we started out, when Coming Back started, we had 5 funders. We now have 25 different foundations and philanthropists that have chosen to join us and to support the collaborative efforts that we have. And there's a whole range. So there are some organizations that what they're trying to do is bring groups of funders in a particular area, like in education or in early childhood together. But the purpose is just to learn from each other, to share and learn. And that's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, you have collaborative funds, where everybody pools their funding, and they jointly agree on the strategy and the decisions. And you have everything in between as well. So you have settings in which a group of funders or foundations roughly agree on a strategy or a direction, but each one does their own separate funding. And in general, we think for sure more collaboration is needed, but it is also very difficult to do. And many times you do need these intermediary organizations that kind of hold everybody to account, bring them to the table, and that support it, because without resources, collaboration doesn't really happen.
I think collaboration is one of those much misused words that again gets sprayed onto strategies and websites. And I've seen it work really well where there's a very specific goal or a very specific thing that people are trying to achieve, because everyone understands the thing that they're trying to aim towards. But it's much harder when it gets to the level of how does my organisation collaborate at a mission level with other organisations rather than funding a specific project. And there's a kind of paradox here. There's a paradox for my organisation that we say that the change that we're seeking emerges from the behaviour of whole systems, not from individual organisations or projects. And yet we're an organisation that's trying to bring about change. And so how does our mission and our contribution relate to the behaviours and dynamics of the whole system? Because we're trying to get at the intersection of homelessness, drug misuse, mental illness. That itself is linked to the economy, to politics, to community development, to all sorts of different things that sit out with our specific mission. And we're faced with the question of, well, actually, in order for our stuff to work, a lot of this other bigger stuff has to work. But we, partly because of the way that charities in the UK are held to account by the Charity Commission, have to specifically talk about our own impact as if it wasn't connected with everybody else's. So how do we play our part as part of a kind of healthy emerging system, rather than do what we're all incentivized to do, which is to pursue our own individual organizational glory? And so that requires a surrendering of power. But how does that work? Well, we have started to work with a number of foundations on a place-based, a potential place-based initiative. The advert's out at the moment, and what we learned from that is the starting point has to be not money or even the specific thing that each one of us wants to achieve, but relationships. Like any system is made up of interrelated parts, and that is made up of human relationships and how people come together and understand each other and start to trust each other. And I think there's this kind of notion of, well, there's 6 pots of money there, so you guys ought to be able to collaborate on achieving that thing, and it's ridiculous that you don't. But we're also human beings behind the pots of money. And the bit that we always miss is creating the space between us all to start understanding what the whole is that is bigger than the sum of the parts. And that is a very human process of relationship building and trust building. So, yes, I think that we are getting to a point where collaboration is going to become the is going to move from just being the thing that we all feel that we ought to do to being the bit which, if we don't do this, we're all going to die. But actually, you can't just wave a magic wand and say we're all now going to be brilliant in collaboration. It's back to the transitions point. If we want something, we have to invest in the processes of achieving it. And again, foundations do not want to invest in these processes because it's not a thing that they can point to and say, we've achieved this, and this organisation has achieved this outcome through our money. It is a much more diffuse process of building uncountable things like trust.
I'd love to bring that down one level and just think about your own experiences where your organization collaborated with another organization, and you will see that most of those collaborations are fundamentally based on trust. And it's not organizations that collaborate, it's individuals, it's individual relationships, and people are the ones that move their organization to be able to. So making these links, building this trust between individuals is what starts to change the context.
Well, I think you got your money's worth on that question. I recognize that we're quite short of time now, so I think we can have one more question. And the young woman in the third row. Oh, there's two of you. Oh, well.
Should we elaborate on
our
Okay. This is going to be awesome. All right. Hi there, I'm Gina Cicerone, and I am at the Fair Education Alliance. And we are a coalition of 130 organizations dedicated to ending educational inequality. So my mind is buzzing. I feel like I'm on a game show. There's like buzzers ringing. Everything is really resonating this morning. But I just want to pick up on a question I've had on my paper for about 30 minutes now. And Julian and Silvia, it's your last 2 points. So for the past 3 years, we have spent building trust. We have gotten to a point where we grew from 20 founding members to 130, probably soon to be 180 in September. From unions and practitioners to corporates, right? And I think, Silvia, to your point, our funders are members as well, right? About getting them involved. And now we are taking on the innovation unit from Teach First to make it much more practical. From that collective voice piece to actually saying, let's have action, let's utilize the trust that we've built into collective action. And one of the questions that I'd be really curious to explore with your comment, Julian, is that I think it has been really hard, whilst we can say, yes, this is about this end goal, there's still going to be so much work that is just about connecting and learning. And we have still found that as we're going out for funding right now, we have about 7 weeks left. There is still so much more emphasis on funding our innovation programs, right? Scaling organizations, on helping entrepreneurship. And so I'm really curious, Silvia, you mentioned flexibility, long-term, sufficient. But what are those practical steps, and how would you see about like framing this and having that dialogue when it really comes down to the fact that I just don't think it is as appealing for funders? Does that resonate with your question?
Actually, that does. So, so Katie Boswell, I'm here from NPC, and I work with both charities and funders who are taking a systems change approach. So actually, building on that point about the dialogue between funders and charities, one of the things that I do hear from charities is a sort of sense that funders, as the ones with the money and the resources, are, if you like, setting the terms of systems change. And I think this is really interesting, going back to the power dynamics point, and also building on kind of critiques of philanthropy that we're seeing, such as Anand Giridharadas, winner takes all, and sort of this idea that those with the money get to sort of set the terms of engagement. And so I just wondered if the panel feel that there is a risk that actually, because this is seen as owned by foundations and philanthropists, and feel free to challenge that, but if it is seen as owned by them, then is there a risk that it is sort of tempering the potential disruptive or radical or transformational aspect of systems change?
I mean, two great questions. I venture a short answer. So on the first one, the answer is actually, I don't know. It is incredibly hard to get philanthropists and foundations to actually believe in this and change their practices. It is incredibly hard. They've been doing it like that for a long time. There's no pressure on them to change. Why would they change? They can continue doing what they do and have their annual report and talk about what they have achieved. And It's what it is. So I think part of the thing is just this dialogue, is starting to see that their individual choices are good for them, but are they really having the impact in the world that we could be having? And, it's just the work of, especially for an organization like yours that tries to bring the founders together and put forward a different point of view. It's what it is. On your question, there's been a lot of critiques of philanthropy recently, and I think if we look at it at the macro level, for sure, philanthropy is a result of a certain system that we created in the world, whatever you want to call it, right? Now, speaking with Anand and also with Rob Wright as well, some of the critiques of philanthropy, which I think some of those arguments are valid, also can be somewhat addressed by philanthropists giving up a little bit of control. And two things I would say. First is working with others, so this idea of collaboratives where they give up some control. And secondly, for both of their points, really supporting government and working with government, not trying to bypass government, because I think that's also a point of addressing some of the critiques that have been raised.
I have two very short responses. One is, funders are realizing that. I sense a real momentum that this discussion is changing. So there are funders coming around the Shift the Power movement that came out of the community philanthropy, Edge. So funders are really starting to think about their power and that in that dialogue, how they need to change their practice. And the second one is on who sets the agenda. I think that's a really valid question. Certainly the Just Transition agenda came out of the grassroots movement. That wasn't something that funders came up with. They just picked it up and are trying to amplify it and trying to identify where they fit into that. So I think the best work, again, doesn't just happen in some elite thinking, but comes out of a momentum, and funders are very much part of that movement.
I think the dilemmas and tensions that we're describing here today are not unique to philanthropy. So you have any conversation with government, and public servants are desperately trying to work out how to tap into the change that needs to happen in a way that shifts power and doesn't reinforce the hierarchies and control mechanisms that have created the problem in the first place. So I think we're all wrestling with this question of who do I need to be in this transitional phase in order to be a bit more part of the solution or the future I'm trying to create, and a bit less part of the past and the problem I'm trying to solve. And each of us has to sort of address that within ourselves. And so on the one hand, I think there is a real urgency to helping different actors, including the state, including philanthropy, go on that journey, which is one of self-awareness and a kind of letting go of the things that allow us to feel competent and safe and certain, because surrendering ourselves up to the interconnectedness of everything is really hard for human beings, because we like to compartmentalize and control, and sort of recognizing that we don't know tends to make us quite angry. So helping people to go on that journey, and we've had at Lankelly Chase, we've had to work so hard and get quite a lot of help to help us shift who we are being, because you kind of cling on for dear life to the old certainties, because it helps us understand who we are. So I think there is a real thing for, and it may be the infrastructure that has become created around philanthropy that can help foundations make some of this shift. I don't know. And I think the other bit there is that while I fundamentally believe that we will always need a state and public servants, but that there are many different versions of a state and of a public servant that we can envisage, it cannot be off the table that we can't imagine a future without philanthropy. That a given is that philanthropy is an inevitable part of the system that we have all created, and that we will always need it, and that rich people shouldn't pay their taxes and become citizens along with the rest of us, rather than all-powerful people who get to make big decisions about other people's lives. And so there is, in the midst of all of this system change, there has to be enough space for a system change which envisages a world where we don't need to be in rooms like this talking about this funny thing called philanthropy and grant making, but where the money sits where it needs to sit. And so it gets said time and time again that charities should put themselves out of business, that charities are dependent on the very thing they're trying to solve staying in existence so the charity can perpetuate. Philanthropy is exactly the same. And so there has to be a way in which philanthropy can edge itself out of existence, to use your own phrase, and find different ways that the money can be repatriated to the people who need that money and where it needs to be. And if philanthropy can't imagine a future without itself, then it can't be an engine for system change. Because you can't be something that needs the system to stay in place and be advocating for change at the same time.
Well, on that very eloquent note, I regretfully have to bring this to a close. And see, you can see systems change is passionate as well. Who knew? First of all, I want to make a few thanks before we go to the video, and then I want to still give you a few minutes for networking. But first, I want to thank the audience, because your engagement with the issues, which it is a challenging issue, I think, and many of you might even walk away thinking, oh, do I really know what systems change is? But you do after having heard from our three excellent panelists. But I thank you for your engagement. I want to thank Alliance for their hard work on this, and Amy and her team in particular. Thomson Reuters for obviously giving us this wonderful room and a lovely breakfast, and a 30% discount on their next conference. And I also especially want to thank Charles for choosing this perfect panel. I really think everybody brought exactly something quite unique and specific to the topic of systems change. But there was also quite a lot of complementarity as well, and I appreciate hearing in great detail, I know Global Greengrants well, so I like hearing even in more detail how very specifically small sums of money can have a huge impact. And we know that through your personal journey and where you have ended up now, I think you also have been through your own system change. So I think you brought a lot, Silvia, to this very excellent conversation. And Julian, thank you for the guest editing, and also thank you for your contribution today.